a locked door. A missing key, a mystery that refuses to stay hidden. Welcome to Morse Chronicles. I am your host, Fenris. Tell me where you're tuning in from. I love seeing this community grow. Your voices make every mystery unforgettable. Let's begin. It was December when the case first began to stir, though I did not know it then. The river moved slowly beneath Magdalen Bridge, a sluggish vein carrying with it the detritus of autumn. The air was brittle with frost, and the city seemed wrapped in a silence only broken by the occasional scrape of a bicycle chain or the hollow tolling of bells. Oxford wears its melancholy well in winter, as if the stone itself grows tired of brilliance. I recall pausing there longer than was necessary, my breath turning to mist above the dark water, watching a pair of swans cut a pale line across the current. Later, in my rooms, I tried to distract myself with a crossword. A clue about an old poet, 6 letters, yielded to me at once. Milton, too easy and therefore unsatisfying. I opened the whiskey, as one does not from thirst but from a desire for warmth that no radiator can summon. The crossword remained unfinished, the silence of the river having followed me indoors. It is strange how the mind catches upon a fragment and will not let it go. The swans, their mirrored forms, the faint impression of something hidden beneath the surface. It was the next morning when Lewis mentioned, almost idly, that the body of a man had been recovered near the river path. No name given yet. A passerby had seen a shape caught among the reeds. Lewis's voice carried the neutrality of habit, but I heard in it the reluctance that comes when a routine death begins to raise questions. I asked if he had seen the body himself. He shook his head. Only the uniformed officers for now. But there was a note of curiosity, and I knew it would not be long before we were called to look. I walked with him to the spot, though the light was already failing by mid-afternoon. The sky pressed low, heavy with a greyness that seeped into everything. A constable nodded as we passed. The reeds, broken and wet, bore the marks of the recovery. The body had been removed, but absence is often louder than presence. I imagined the man's last moments, the cold water against his face, the muffled city beyond. There was no blood on the path, no struggle apparent. Suicide, perhaps, though the river rarely grants such kindness. Lewis pointed to the embankment where a discarded glove lay half submerged in mud. Not police issue, not new either. He seemed inclined to leave it as chance, but I bent to examine it, noticing the stitching along the wrist had begun to fray on one side only. A left-handed man, then, pulling it on too often with his dominant hand. It was a detail too small to matter, and yet I tucked it into my mind. Knowing such details have a way of returning. The air smelled of damp paper, though no paper was visible. A trick of association, perhaps, born of years among libraries where mold and rain lingered in the bindings. Still, I thought of books falling into water, the ink dissolving, words breaking apart until they were unreadable. There is something obscene about erasure, even when it comes softly. Lewis asked if I thought the man had intended to die there. I answered only that the river was an indifferent witness. He did not press me further. We stood a while longer, the silence punctuated by the creak of the bridge above us, bicycles rattling over stone. I felt the weight of December pressing close, the peculiar sadness of endings, though the case itself had barely begun. Later that night I returned to the crossword. The clue about Milton had already yielded, but another remained stubborn, a 7-letter word for concealment. I tried shadow, disguise, curtain, none of them fitted. It was only after the whiskey had begun to dull the edges of the day that I wrote the word shrouds across the squares. And I wondered then if the river, too, was capable of such concealment, its black water wrapping around secrets until the cold itself decided to give them back. I remember the room first for its stillness. There are rooms in Oxford that have absorbed too much silence, the kind that thickens the air, making the sound of one's own breath a faint intrusion. This one belonged to the riverman, though no one had spoken his name with certainty yet. It was above a tobacconist's on the high, a narrow flight of stairs leading upward into dust and shadow. The constable who let us in remarked that it had the look of a place recently abandoned. I thought it looked instead like somewhere that had been waiting too long for someone to return. The curtains were drawn against the pale afternoon, but the light leaked through unevenly, pooling in half shapes on the carpet. A bed unmade, a table with a glass still carrying the mark of a mouth, and a faint smell of damp wool mixed with stale tobacco. Lewis said quietly that it seemed a lonely place. I told him most rooms are if one stays long enough. I walked to the desk, its surface scattered with papers, receipts, an unopened letter. The handwriting on the envelope suggested hesitation, strokes uncertain, as though the writer were imitating their own hand. I noted that the ink had smudged slightly, a sign it had been written in haste, perhaps without blotting. Small things, but they seldom failed to whisper. Lewis bent over the fireplace, examining the ash. He said it looked as though something had been burned recently, though not completely. I joined him, peering into the grey remains. A fragment of paper, half charred, revealed only the letters Ox before the fire had claimed the rest. Oxford, Oxonian. Something trivial, perhaps. But the coincidence of place and ash seemed too neat. I thought of crosswords again, how a single syllable can lead you astray unless held firmly against the grid. The wardrobe yielded little, a coat with frayed cuffs, a pair of boots still damp at the soles, and the faint, metallic tang of old coins or forgotten keys. No suitcase, which suggested either he had never intended to leave or that he had already gone somewhere else before the river claimed him. Lewis remarked that the boots showed signs of mud not from the riverbank, but clay, the kind that clings stubbornly. He was right. The path near Christchurch Meadow had that very soil in winter. I let the observation rest between us, knowing it might grow roots later. The silence pressed closer the longer we stayed. Even the creak of the floorboards seemed reluctant, as though disturbed by our presence. I tried to imagine the man himself, moving about this dim chamber, pouring himself a drink at the table, pausing by the window to look out at the passing carriages and bicycles. Rooms often hold on to gestures long after their owners have gone. It is we who must learn to see them. On the table, beneath the glass, lay a folded crossword torn from a newspaper, half filled, the letters written in a precise but heavy hand. One clue caught my attention, 10 across, 6 letters meaning truth concealed. The answer he had written was veiled. Not incorrect, but imprecise. The true solution should have been latent. That small misstep gave me pause. It suggested either a mind too weary to distinguish, or one deliberately choosing the lesser word. There is a kind of confession in the answers people accept too easily. Lewis asked what I thought. I said only that the room had seen more than it wished to, but less than we needed. He frowned but did not press. I could not tell him that the crossword, the burnt fragment, the damp boots, all of it spoke of someone trying unsuccessfully to cover their tracks. And yet, even in failure, they had managed to leave us with nothing more than shadows. When we left, the door closed behind us with a sound that seemed final, though I knew it was only temporary. I glanced once more at the window above the tobacconist's. No figure stood there, no watcher remained. Only the fading light of December touched the glass, pale and indifferent, like a witness unwilling to speak. It was Lewis who first suggested the college. He had spoken with the constable again, and there had been mention of a name tentative, attached to the drowned man, a part-time lecturer, known more for his solitary habits than any contribution to scholarship. A man half inside Oxford, half outside it, belonging fully to neither world. The sort one notices only when they vanish. We walked through the drizzle toward the quad, the stones glistening as though varnished by centuries of damp. Colleges in winter seem to tighten their walls, their arches narrowing into secrecy. The porter, his face stiff with the formality that conceals both ignorance and disdain, confirmed the man had lodged there until a few months ago. He offered little else, save for a faintly disdainful remark that the fellow was behind on his rent. I thanked him, and he gave me a look that implied gratitude was wasted. The stairwell smelled of chalk and old varnish, and each step upward seemed to withdraw us further from the world beyond the gates. At the door of the former rooms I paused, though I knew they would be bare. Still, a place once lived in carries its absences like scars. The walls inside were stripped of pictures, but the shadows of frames remained, paler rectangles against the faded plaster. I traced one with my eyes, and thought of how easily lives reduce themselves to outlines, their contents stripped away until only impressions linger. Lewis remarked that it felt colder here than outside. I agreed, though perhaps it was the memory of what had once filled the air. A scrap of timetable lay forgotten under the desk, listing lectures on medieval poetry. Marginal notes in a spidery hand observed that truth is often cloaked in allegory. I turned the page over, but nothing else remained. We descended into the library, the real heart of any college. It was not difficult to imagine the man seated at one of the long oak tables, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting toward shelves that never ran out of silence. The librarian, a woman with an expression that tolerated nothing superfluous, said she remembered him well enough. He read more than he borrowed. He once asked after a book on cryptography, but never checked it out. She gave a faint smile, the kind that hid more than it revealed. I asked if he spoke much. She replied that some silences are louder than words. Lewis grew restless, as he often did when the answers remained cloaked. He asked what I made of it. I said only that a man looking for codes is rarely seeking entertainment. Perhaps he was searching for a key to something unreadable, or perhaps merely disguising himself in puzzles. I thought of the crossword left behind in the other room, the careless substitution of veiled for latent, a slip of the pen, or a deliberate hesitation. In one corner of the library I found an index card lodged between two volumes, forgotten or misplaced. It bore a single line in that same uncertain hand, quid latet apparibit. What is hidden shall be revealed. A student's musing or something else? Lewis frowned as I read it aloud. He asked if I believed it connected to the man's death. I told him belief is a poor companion in investigation, but even as I spoke I knew the words would not leave me. When we stepped outside again, the rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones slick with reflection. Gaslight shimmered in the puddles like fragile stars. I felt the peculiar weight that Oxford casts upon its own tragedies, turning each into a parable. Academic shadows, yes, but not the kind found only in books. The kind that lengthen across corridors, waiting until someone notices they have been walking in them all along. I thought again of the charred paper, the boots with their clay, the crossword folded beside a half-empty glass. Each detail was a syllable, and together they might form a word. But as yet it was a word I could not pronounce. It was the ink that returned to me, as though it had been waiting in some dim corner of recollection. The letter I had seen in that room above the tobacconist, the strokes of the pen faltering, smudged, as though the hand itself had trembled or rushed. Ink tells its own story. It bleeds, it lingers, it betrays. Lewis had brought the page to me in the late morning, folded carefully inside a plastic sleeve. He remarked, not without irony, that the laboratory might make more of it than I ever could. I told him they might, though the truth was I trusted my eyes more than the clinical certainties of men in white coats. I sat with the letter at my desk, letting the fire in the grate throw uneven light across it, and read each word with the kind of attention one gives to a crossword clue that refuses to yield. The handwriting was hesitant, but it was the spacing that troubled me. Too much distance between certain words, an awkward crowding of others. People write as they think, and thinking, when uneven, leaves its trace. At the bottom, where a signature should have rested, there was instead a simple dash, as though the writer had intended to sign and stopped short. Lewis asked if that was important. I said that nothing unfinished is ever without meaning. I reached for the crossword I had left unfinished on the table. 11 down, 8 letters, the clue reading incomplete or left undone. The answer presented itself now with irritating clarity. Aborted. I wrote it in and felt, absurdly, that the letter and the clue had been speaking to one another across the room. The kind of coincidence only Oxford seems to nurture, where words themselves conspire. In the afternoon we walked again through Christ Church Meadow, the clay clinging to our boots as it had to his. Lewis said the college librarian had remembered another detail. The drowned man had once inquired after volumes of Renaissance ciphers. Not a field most lecturers pursued idly. I asked if the librarian had seemed surprised. Lewis shrugged. She had seemed amused, he said, though in Oxford amusement often conceals unease. We stopped under a bare tree, the branches clawing at the greyness above. I thought of the ink again, and of the way the strokes faltered only when spelling certain words, words like hidden, like silence. A hand betrays more than a voice, I said. Lewis asked if I thought the man had been afraid. Perhaps, I replied, but fear often hides itself in neat lines and tidy margins. It is hesitation that betrays it. Later, in the college library once more, I asked to see the drowned man's borrowings. The records, carefully written in blue ink, showed a fondness for obscure poets, allegorical treatises, and more recently, manuals of cryptography. At the bottom of the last page, a note had been scribbled. Not by the librarian, but in that same halting hand, a sequence of numbers meaningless at first glance. Lewis frowned, suggesting it was perhaps a shelf mark written carelessly. I shook my head. Numbers written without context often hide a context too obvious to declare. We sat in the echoing silence, the oak tables stretching like docks into an ocean of books. I studied the numbers and felt something stir, some half-recognition. They bore the pattern not of inventory but of dates, days and months transposed, a personal code perhaps. I said as much but softly, not wishing to claim more than a whisper of certainty. When we left the library, the evening bells were beginning, their sound rolling across the roofs with the melancholy of centuries. Lewis remarked that we were no closer than before. I told him that sometimes the smallest inkling, like a miswritten word or a smudge of ink, was the only beginning one could hope for. And as I said it, I thought again of that dash at the bottom of the letter, that unfinished signature, as though the man had paused on the brink of declaring himself and chosen instead to vanish. Oxford has a way of swallowing voices, but ink, once set, never entirely fades. There are details that cling to memory not because of their magnitude, but because of their quiet persistence. In this case it was a stain, red against the pale grain of an oak table, half hidden beneath a stack of journals in the common room of the college. Wine, not blood, though at first glance one could imagine otherwise. I remember running a finger lightly along its edge, feeling the roughness where the liquid had seeped into the wood, and thinking how often lives leave their traces in accidents of carelessness. Lewis asked if I thought it significant. I told him that significance is rarely obedient. It appears where it pleases. He frowned, sensing in my words what I did not say. The stain was old but not ancient. It had not yet dulled to brown. Someone had spilled their glass here not long before the man disappeared into the river. The room around us bore the signs of conviviality drained away, empty bottles lined along a sideboard, a corkscrew abandoned as if in mid-gesture, chairs pushed back without symmetry. College wine evenings always end in such disarray. Yet there was something peculiar in the air, a hush that had nothing to do with the usual Oxford reverence. Conversations leave a sediment, and here it seemed heavier than laughter could account for. The steward entered briefly, a man more attuned to accounts than secrets. He said the deceased had attended the last gathering reluctantly, pressed by colleagues to show his face. He had left early, carrying his coat but not finishing his glass. I asked if anything unusual had occurred. He hesitated, then muttered that the man had argued quietly with another don near the fire, though the words had not carried. A whisper, he called it, though whispers often roar in retrospect. Lewis muttered that arguments at college dinners were hardly rare. I agreed, but added that most do not end beside a river. He shook his head, impatient with my tendency toward shadows, but said no more. I studied the journals piled across the stain. Their spines bore titles on allegory, cryptography, and fragments of obscure verse. One page had been folded, marking a poem in which truth was described as wine pressed from unseen vineyards. The coincidence was crude, yet I have never believed in accidents of metaphor. I noted the page number 37. Later, I would find that same number scribbled among the drowned man's belongings. But at the time it was only a flicker. Lewis pointed out a chair near the hearth, its arms scuffed, as though gripped tightly in a moment of tension. He asked if I thought the argument had been more than academic. I said only that men often clutch at wood when words fail them. We left the common room and walked the cloisters in silence, the air damp with the promise of rain. A student passed us, head bowed, and in his stride I glimpsed the faint limp of distraction, the kind that comes from listening too intently to one's own thoughts. Oxford teaches its young to walk as though concealing something. I wondered whether our drowned man had walked that way too. Back in my rooms later, I returned to the crossword spread across the table. 14 across, 5 letters meaning residue. I wrote dregs without hesitation, and the answer seemed to echo with the evening's inquiry. The dregs of wine, the remnants of whispers, the fragments a man leaves when he departs too soon. Not proof, not even a clue, but a resonance. I poured myself a measure of whiskey and thought of the stain on the table. It would fade, perhaps be sanded away, but not yet. For a while longer it would remain an uninvited witness, and I wondered whether the man himself had been like that stain, half erased already, but clinging still to the surface, refusing to vanish completely. I remember the rain had stopped by the time we reached the college gates, though the stone beneath our feet still glistened as if reluctant to let go of it. A figure stood just beyond the ironwork, half in shadow, half in the dim spill of a lantern fixed above. She wore a coat too thin for the evening and held herself with a stillness that seemed rehearsed. Lewis asked if I recognized her. I said no, though something in the tilt of her head stirred a faint echo of memory. She introduced herself with hesitation, a surname that carried a foreign lilt softened by years in Oxford. She said she had known the dead man, though she did not call him a friend. Acquaintance, perhaps, she corrected, and the word seemed to carry more weight than it should. Lewis asked why she had waited here rather than calling at the lodge. She replied that gates are thresholds, and she had not yet decided if she wished to cross. I thought then that she belonged as much to the city's shadows as to its light. Her eyes lingered on me more than once, as if measuring what kind of man I was, what kind of listener. She spoke of meetings in libraries, conversations that began with poetry and ended in fragments of cipher. She said he had grown secretive in recent months, carrying notebooks he never showed, speaking less, drinking more. She lowered her voice when she admitted he feared someone, though she could not say whom. Fear has many disguises, and perhaps she mistook his solitude for it. I asked when she had last seen him. She said the night of the wine-stained gathering, when he had left early, glancing once at her as though to speak, then passing out into the rain without a word. She had followed him to the gate, she said, but not beyond. She had remained where she now stood, listening to the sound of his steps fade into the night. Lewis asked if she believed he had enemies. She smiled faintly, a gesture that seemed to conceal more than it revealed. In Oxford, she said, everyone has enemies, though most of them are hidden behind civility and Latin tags. She paused then, her gaze drifting toward the tower above us where the bells slept until their next appointed hour. It was not her words that stayed with me most, but her hands. She kept them folded tightly together, as though restraining them from betraying something. And when at last she shifted, the lantern light caught her fingers, stained faintly with ink, the kind that seeps beneath nails and lingers for days. Lewis did not notice, but I did. Few outside the college scribes and librarians handle ink with such persistence. I asked if she wrote much. She replied too quickly that she did not. The denial hung in the damp air longer than truth would have. We parted with courtesy. She slipped back into the night, her figure merging with the mist that gathered along the high. Lewis muttered that she had told us little we did not already know. I said perhaps, but words are not the only things spoken. He asked what I meant, but I left him to puzzle it. Some deductions arrive only when the silence around them is thick enough. Later in my rooms, I unfolded the crossword once more. 17 down, 5 letters, a clue for barrier or threshold. I wrote gate and thought of her waiting there, unwilling to cross, unwilling to leave. The answer seemed too obvious, too neat, yet it fitted. And sometimes neatness, in its very simplicity, betrays more than complication ever could. The whiskey burned quietly as I poured it. Outside, the bells began again, their sound dampened by fog, rolling like a lament across the city. I thought of the woman at the gate, her ink-stained hands, her half-truths, and I knew she, like the stain on the table and the dash at the bottom of the letter, would not easily fade. There are moments in any investigation when the mind seizes upon an answer with the hunger of a starving man, and yet the answer is wrong. I recall that evening with a peculiar clarity, because for a brief span of hours I allowed myself the luxury of certainty. For it was, of course, an illusion. Certainty is a dangerous draught, and I should have known better. Lewis and I had been walking back across the quad, our boots scattering the silence pooled between cloisters. He had suggested, not unreasonably, that the woman at the gate had played a larger role than she admitted. Ink-stained fingers, furtive meetings, words withheld. He spoke of her with the bluntness of one who prefers human motives neat, jealousy, fear, betrayal. He asked if I thought she might have driven the man toward the river. I said perhaps, though I spoke without conviction. In truth, I was weary of the weight of possibility. Back in my rooms, I opened the newspaper to the crossword, that old companion whose cruelties and mercies mirror the investigation itself. 19 across 6 letters read wrong answer to a clue. I smiled at the irony and filled in the word misfit. A pleasing solution, neat, but as always too quick. Later I would discover the correct word had been error. The letter from the tobacconist's room returned to my thoughts. The unfinished dash, the hesitating script, the smudge of ink. I began to believe it had been a note to the woman, abandoned in fear or disgust. It explained her waiting at the gate, her reluctance to enter, her silence when pressed. I told myself it was coherent, and coherence often seduces more powerfully than truth. The following morning we met again with the steward, who confirmed that she and the drowned man had been seen in conversation more than once, their heads close, voices low. He said he thought nothing of it at the time. I took his words as confirmation of the theory already coiling in my mind, though even then a voice within whispered caution. Lewis looked satisfied. He said it was becoming clearer. The man involved with a woman, secrets exchanged, a quarrel by the fire, and then despair by the river. He said perhaps the simplest solution was the correct one. I nodded, though inwardly I recoiled. Simplest solutions rarely exist outside detective fiction. Still I clung to the shape of it, needing a framework in which to rest. It was only later that the illusion began to crack. We were shown a notebook retrieved from the college library, one the drowned man had left behind weeks earlier. Its pages bore no declarations of love, no confessions. Instead, there were columns of numbers, transposed letters, fragments of Latin phrases. It was a cipher in progress, half made, half deciphered. I stared at the page and knew at once that my solution, so neatly fitted the night before, had been false. Lewis asked what I saw in it. I told him nothing yet. He pressed me, but I remained silent. To confess the error would have been to admit that I had allowed myself to believe too easily. And yet the crossword had warned me. Misfit was the wrong answer, no matter how well it seemed to sit within the grid. That evening, as the bells of Magdalen carried their sorrow across the river, I poured myself a whiskey and stared at the cipher until the numbers blurred. The woman at the gate, the wine stain on the table, the unfinished letter, all of it remained, but not as answers. They had become instead fragments of a puzzle whose true shape still refused to appear. And I realized then that I had mistaken shadows for substance. Oxford thrives on such mistakes. It feeds on them, cloaks them in silence, and waits for the patient to look again. And so I sat with my false solution, chastened, knowing that the truth, when it came, would arrive quietly without permission, and far later than I wished. The danger of chasing shadows is that one begins to mistake them for figures of substance. I had already suffered the indignity of a false solution, and yet another shape soon presented itself, luring us down a path that ended, once more, in fog. Perhaps it is only in retrospect that one sees the persistence of misdirection, the way Oxford arranges its mysteries like a chessboard, where each piece is disguised as another. It began with a remark from Lewis. He had been speaking with a porter at another college, and the man had recalled seeing the drowned fellow in the company of a gentleman from the Bodleian. A librarian or so, he thought, though he could not recall the name. A tall man, spectacles, a certain stiffness of manner. Lewis suggested that perhaps the drowned man had been working on something beyond his academic pretensions, that a hidden collaborator had drawn him into more dangerous waters. I listened without comment, though inwardly I felt the theory cling to me like damp wool. That afternoon we walked into the Bodleian, past the scent of vellum and old bindings, into the long chamber where light falls reluctantly from high windows. The assistant at the desk confirmed that a lecturer had indeed been consulting cipher manuscripts in the weeks before his death, under the guidance of a senior scholar. She named him, a figure familiar enough in Oxford circles, precise, unfriendly, the sort of man whose entire life was ordered into footnotes. We were shown into his office, where the air smelled faintly of ink and dust. He received us with the courtesy of one interrupted, adjusting his spectacles with fingers as thin as quills. Yes, he said, he had known the man. Yes, they had spoken of codes and forgotten languages. Yes, he had noticed a certain agitation, though he assumed it owed more to drink than to discovery. He denied knowledge of any quarrel, denied even noticing the woman whose presence haunted the edges of our inquiries. Lewis asked bluntly if he thought the drowned man capable of violence. The scholar blinked, as though the question itself were an indecency. Violence, he murmured, is rarely the prerogative of scholars. I thought of the ink on the woman's hands, of the wine-stained table, of the charred paper in the grate. and wondered how many violences pass unnoticed in Oxford because they are cloaked in learning. On his desk lay a crossword puzzle, abandoned midway, its neat squares filled with answers that betrayed a too pedantic mind. I glanced at one, 20 across, 9 letters meaning misleading clue. He had written diversion. Correct enough, though somehow it struck me as too deliberate, too calculated. I asked if the drowned man had ever completed one with him. He said no, though he offered a faint smile, a scholar's indulgence of trivial pursuits. As we left, Lewis whispered that he found the man suspicious. His detachment, his evasions, his convenient presence in the puzzle of ciphers and codes. I said perhaps. But even then I felt the wrongness of it. He was not a man of action, not one who would drag another into a river's dark mouth. He was a red herring, I realized later, as carefully positioned as the first false trail we had followed. And yet, like the crossword, even the wrong answers must be written before the right one appears. That evening rain returned, striking the panes of my rooms with the insistence of questions unanswered. I poured a measure of whiskey and stared at my own crossword. 10 down, 7 letters, a clue for illusion. I wrote chimera and felt the satisfaction of fit. The drowned man's life seemed full of such chimeras, women at gates, scholars in shadows, numbers without context. Each a phantom solution, each receding when touched. Oxford thrives on such second red herrings, on making its seekers circle again and again until fatigue itself becomes part of the test. And I, weary but unwilling to yield, sat in the dark with chimera scrawled across the page, knowing it was both the answer and not the answer at all. It was Lewis who brought me the diary, though not without reluctance. He had found it among the drowned man's papers, tucked behind volumes of poetry, the cover plain, the binding frayed. I could see he had hesitated before handing it over, as though a diary belonged to the dead more than to the living. I told him that privacy is a fragile thing, and death rarely preserves it. He said nothing, but the weight of the little book lay heavily in his hands before it passed into mine. The page in question was not the first, nor the last. It sat somewhere in the middle, half-filled, the ink dark enough to suggest recent use. A short entry, almost abrupt, without the ornamentation one expects of a lecturer in literature. A date, a name I did not recognize, and then a single line that seemed more cipher than confession. The key is silence, the truth unwritten. I read it aloud to Lewis. He frowned and muttered that it meant nothing. I said meaning often hides itself until the right question is asked. The ink was smudged along the lower edge, as though the hand that wrote it had trembled, or as though the page had been closed too quickly. I held it to the light, tilting it so the faint sheen revealed where the pen had pressed harder, leaving grooves. Beneath the line I could just make out an indentation, words written on a later page that had imprinted faintly upon this one. I tried to trace them with my fingers, but they dissolved into suggestion. I asked Lewis to fetch a pencil. He looked puzzled but obeyed. Rubbing lightly across the paper, I revealed a fragment of the hidden line, a series of numbers, uneven, perhaps a date, perhaps not. Lewis muttered that it looked like nonsense. I said nonsense, when repeated often enough, begins to sound like code. He shrugged, unwilling to chase shadows yet again. But I knew better than to ignore the persistence of numbers. The atmosphere of the room grew heavier as I read the rest of the diary. Observations on lectures, small notes on colleagues, remarks that bordered on bitterness. He had written often of solitude, though never quite of despair. A man not yet broken but fraying. One passage struck me. In their words I hear only echoes, never voices. So I closed the diary then, for it seemed indecent to go further. Lewis asked if I thought the woman at the gate had seen the diary. I said if she had, she would never admit it. He asked if I believed she was protecting him or betraying him. I told him those roles are not always distinct. He gave me the look of a man tired of ambiguity, but he did not press. That night in my own rooms I returned to the diary page. I opened the crossword beside me, as though one puzzle might illuminate another. 15 across, 8 letters meaning written record. I filled in the word document, though reluctantly, for it felt too obvious, too bold. Still, it fitted. And I thought of the diary as precisely that, a document, a record, but one that refused to speak plainly. Silence was its theme, its ink more notable for what it concealed than what it declared. Outside, rain began again, tapping at the window with a rhythm too steady to ignore. I poured a glass of whiskey and stared at the line until the words blurred. The key is silence, the truth unwritten. I wondered if the drowned man had left the diary for us, or against us. A gift or a decoy? Perhaps both. Oxford is fond of riddles that double back on themselves, fond of truths that remain unwritten until the page itself disintegrates. I closed the diary and set it aside. The fire had grown low, the bells long since silent. In the shadows of that room, the page seemed to breathe quietly, as though waiting for me to admit I understood more than I did. But I did not yet. There are moments when an object, simple in itself, begins to draw the entire gravity of a case toward it. For me it was a lock, and the absence of its key. The drowned man's belongings, laid out in silence by the constable, looked ordinary enough. A watch that no longer ticked, a fountain pen leaking faintly at the nib, coins dulled by river water. And among them a small brass lock, detached from any case or clasp. Its arch still fastened, though nothing remained to bind. Lewis remarked that it was worthless. I told him that worth is not the same as weight, and this lock was heavier than it seemed. We carried it back with us, and in my rooms I set it on the desk beside the diary. I turned it over in my hands, listening to the faint rattle of its mechanism. A lock without a key is either a relic of something broken, or a guardian of something yet hidden. Lewis asked if perhaps the key had been lost in the river. I said perhaps, though I doubted it. Keys rarely stray far from their locks. The diary returned to my mind. That strange line, "The key is silence, the truth unwritten." Was it a metaphor, or was the man clinging to literal fact? Lewis grew restless with what he called riddles. He said we were no nearer than before. I poured him a glass and told him that sometimes the nearness is invisible until it breathes against one's neck. He did not thank me for the comfort. Later I walked alone through the college corridors. The air smelled of damp wool and paper, the floorboards protesting in whispers beneath my tread. At the end of one passage stood a heavy oak door, its handle scratched, its keyhole dark. I pressed the little brass lock against it, absurdly, as though they might acknowledge one another. They did not, yet I could not shake the feeling that the drowned man had carried it with purpose, not as accident. The librarian, when pressed, admitted she had seen him with a small locked box, something he kept within his satchel. She assumed it contained nothing more than letters, or perhaps money. She said once she saw him holding it with both hands, his face turned as though listening for something inside. I asked what had become of the box. She shrugged. No one had seen it since his death. A vanished box, a lock without key. Oxford enjoys such symmetry. Back in my rooms, I unfolded the day's crossword. 6 down, 3 letters meaning essential. The answer was key, of course, obvious to anyone. Yet when I wrote it into the grid, the word looked strange, as though accusing me of overlooking what had been in front of me all along. Lewis returned late, having spoken again with the woman at the gate. He said she denied ever seeing the lock or the box. He did not believe her, and neither did I. I asked how she looked when she spoke. He said she touched her sleeve often, as though brushing away dust that was not there. I told him that guilt often hides in such gestures. He asked if I thought she had the key. I said perhaps she was the key. The whiskey burned more than usual that night. I sat with the lock before me, its surface reflecting the low flame of the fire. I turned it again and again, listening to the silence it contained. A lock speaks not of what it is, but of what it guards. Without its key it becomes not an answer but a question. And I realized then that the entire case felt much the same. Doors, thresholds, locks, each waiting for a key that may or may not exist. I left the lock on the table when I retired. But in the darkness, I could feel its presence as though it held me rather than I it. The cloisters at dusk hold a sound unlike any other. Not silence, precisely, but an echo that belongs only to stone and centuries, the faint hum of steps long departed. I had gone there not for answers, but for air, the kind of air that presses close yet promises clarity if one lingers. Lewis followed reluctantly, his collar turned up against the damp. He asked why we were walking empty arches instead of questioning again. I told him that sometimes Oxford speaks more truth in shadows than in words. We did not wait long. She was there already, the woman at the gate, her figure drawn thin against the lantern glow. She seemed unsurprised to see me, less so to see Lewis. She asked if we had brought the lock, her voice careful, almost brittle. I told her no, though it sat even then on my desk like an accusation. She nodded, as if expecting the lie. Her words came unevenly, fragments torn from a longer thought. She said the drowned man had trusted her once, had given her pages of notes he no longer wished to carry. She said she had kept them, unread, out of loyalty or fear. It was not clear which. She confessed then that she had burned some of them, the rest hidden where even she could not easily reach them. I asked why. She lowered her gaze, saying only that he had begged her to. Lewis muttered that this was obstruction. She looked at him with tired contempt, as though the word itself were too small for what she carried. I asked her if she knew of the box. She hesitated. She said she had seen him clutch it once, his hands trembling, as though the contents were heavier than the metal itself. She had asked what it contained. He had whispered one word, though she had never been sure she heard correctly. Silence. The rain began again, a thin curtain spilling down through the open arches. I watched a drop trace her cheek, unsure if it was water or something else. She asked if I believed he had taken his own life. I did not answer directly. Instead, I told her that rivers conceal as much as they reveal. She nodded, perhaps grateful, perhaps resentful, I could not tell. Lewis pressed harder, asking if she had seen him that final night. She said she had followed him as far as the meadow, that she had stood by the trees and watched him pause at the riverbank. She said she thought he might have turned back, but he did not. She called out softly, though the wind took her voice. And then he was gone. She swore she had seen no one else, yet her tone carried a fracture that betrayed doubt. There in the cloisters, her confession felt both intimate and incomplete. Words chosen too carefully, pauses weighted too heavily. I noticed then her hands again, folded as before, but this time one finger bore a faint mark where a ring had been recently removed. I asked about it. She looked startled, then said she had lost it. The denial came too quickly, the echo of it lingering longer than the rain. When she left, the cloisters seemed emptier than before, though her presence remained in the air like smoke. Lewis turned to me, frustration in his voice. He said we had gained nothing, that she had spoken but told us nothing we could use. I told him that use and truth are not always the same. He asked if I thought she lied. I said she confessed, but confession is not the same as truth. Back in my rooms, I opened the crossword once more. 13 down 7 letters, admission. The answer was confess. I wrote it in, though the word unsettled me. For confession, like the cloisters, is only an echo, half silence, half sound, and never the whole. There are bells in Oxford whose sound carries not only across stone and water, but across the marrow of memory itself. St. Anselm's was such a bell. Its toll did not merely mark the hour. It announced a reckoning, one long delayed but never denied. I remember standing with Lewis beneath its tower, the air thick with mist, the stone worn smooth by centuries of hands and rain. He muttered that bells were for worship and warning, nothing more. I told him that bells are also for endings. He looked at me oddly, but said no more. We had come because of a note, scribbled in the drowned man's diary and overlooked until that evening. A date and a time, nothing else, written in the margins of a page filled otherwise with silence. That time matched precisely the hour of the bells. Lewis thought it coincidence. I said coincidence rarely carries its weight so neatly. The church itself was nearly deserted, its nave lit only by scattered candles and the faint residue of incense. I walked slowly along the aisle, each step resounding too loudly against the flagstones. The air smelled of wax and damp stone, and somewhere beneath it all the faint musk of wood polish. Lewis waited near the door while I continued forward, my eyes adjusting to the shadows. A verger emerged from the transept, his expression wary, as though conversation were a trespass. He said yes, he had known the drowned man. The fellow came sometimes to sit in silence during evensong, though never to pray. I asked if he came alone. The verger hesitated, then admitted there had been evenings when a woman sat nearby. He did not know her name. I thought then of the gate, the cloisters, the ink upon her hands. Oxford arranges its encounters with too much symmetry for my liking. Lewis whispered later that the bells themselves meant nothing. A man sits in a pew, perhaps restless, perhaps lost, and writes down the time of bells because it fills a void. I told him no. Men do not mark silence with precision unless silence itself holds weight. We climbed the narrow stair to the bell tower, the air colder as we ascended, the walls sweating with condensation. The bells loomed above us, massive, unyielding, their iron throats silent until their appointed hour. I touched the edge of one, feeling the chill seep into my fingers. Beneath the beams in the dust, I noticed the imprint of a boot sole fresher than the rest, clay still clinging in the grooves. Lewis said it could have been anyone. I told him perhaps, but clay does not wander of its own accord. As we descended, the bells began to stir, their weight swinging slowly, their sound unfurling with the solemnity of centuries. The notes rolled outward, down the streets, across the meadow into the river itself. I thought of the drowned man hearing them on his final evening, of the woman waiting at the gate, of the box and its missing key. Each note seemed to strike some hidden chamber within me, and I wondered if we were all, in our way, instruments struck by forces indifferent to our song. That night, back in my rooms, I unfolded the crossword again. 4 across, 5 letters meaning signal. The answer was peal. I wrote it carefully, the letters fitting with an ease that unsettled me. Signal, yes, but of what? A warning? A summons? Or the end of something that had lingered too long? I poured the whiskey and let the bells echo still in my ears. The sound had followed me across the city, persistent as conscience. The drowned man had written their time in his diary, as though anchoring his silence to their voice. And I too could not forget. The bells of St. Anselm had told, not only for him, but for the rest of us who lingered too long among shadows, mistaking them for truth.